containers in your kit that have the Sola wood flower label on them. These are your jars of color dye. You're gonna need a bowl or cup or some kind of a container for mixing your colors, as well as a fork or something to whisk. And then you do need some water for mixing your colors. You don't want super hot or super cold water. Usually room temperature water works best. That way it doesn't damage the flowers. So you're just gonna start by getting all of that dye color in there. This one looks like it's maybe a little bit old. This color is called Morning Frost. There we go. So we're just gonna pour that in. Get all of that in there. You might be wondering, do you have to use the entire container? If you want vibrant colors, you're gonna wanna use the whole container. If you have other flowers that you're gonna use this on, you can save these in the fridge. You can always put them in a Tupperware container with the lid on. We can usually get about 2 weeks of life out of these colors. You might have to add a little bit more water here and there depending on how much you use, but that looks like that's all of that Morning Frost. Go ahead and get that in there. And then we're gonna pour in a little bit of water to start. So usually the ideal ratio is like 1 to 3. 1 part paint to 3 parts water. But you wanna kinda try it first before you add too much water. You don't want it to be runny and have your color look washed out and have to dip it multiple times. You also don't want it to be like soup consistency so that the paint is super thick and chunky. We don't want thick and chunky paint. So I'm gonna try it real quick just on this little flower. That looks good. So I don't need too much more water in there. I could add a little bit more just to kind of help it soak in, but so far so good on that one. So if you're just getting started, go ahead and work on mixing those colors up. And then I'm gonna show some of the other things that should be in your kit while you're working on mixing those colors. All right, so you should have, if you opted for the planter box, you should have one of the wood planter boxes. These are about 6 inches in size. You should also have a foam square to go into your planter box. And if you have multiple people working on the kit together, you can, Kim's running to grab one of the foam squares because that's the one thing we forgot. You can cut the foam square in half and 2 people can share that because you only need a little bit. This is how big it's gonna end up being. So you only need enough foam for these succulents to stick in. So it doesn't have to be a huge, huge piece, just enough. And these are gonna have wires sticking on the bottom of them too. So just enough for those wires to hook into. And then you could have opted to have a stencil to paint on your box. This is a reusable Mylar stencil, so you'll be able to use this on each side of the box. This is different than the normal vinyl stencils that we usually use. These are reusable, so you can use them on this project, you can save them for other things. I will say that the stencil is the hardest part of the tutorial. So if you are kind of looking for the easy route, I would say skip the stencil. You don't have to do the stencil. And you can just paint your box a solid color. But we are gonna do the polka dots on our box tonight. You should also have 2 different grits of sandpaper if you have the box. The really rough one is if you want your box to look old or vintage. And then the really fine one, this is for sanding in between coats of paint. So if you just wanna kind of smooth it out a little bit, that's gonna be the best piece of sandpaper for that. Yeah, that's okay. So this is, it's similar to this. You guys have a green, like a rectangle one, so just be cut in half. You can cut it with an old knife, like an old bread knife works best for trimming those up, but just something that'll go in there for those succulents to hold on to. And then as far as paint and supplies go, you're going to have, you should have a few colors of acrylic paints that you can use for adding the realistic touches. These are just a couple colors that we're gonna use tonight, but if you have other acrylic paints at home in your craft stash, you can use any acrylic paint. These are just regular acrylics. So if you're thinking, I might wanna try some orange or some coral, feel free to grab those while we're working. The spray bottle is what's gonna help those colors soak into the leaves on the succulent so that they look more realistic. And then you kind of have a menagerie of paintbrushes. So for your box, you'll have a bigger brush, either like this or bigger than this, like a base coat solid brush. You should have some little detail brushes, so tiny little brushes for painting the succulent details on. And then you might have a foam brush or a foam wedge for your stencil. If you have kids at home and they have like these grubby old kid paintbrushes, these work really good for the stencil too. So we'll kind of alternate back and forth between these so you can get the best outcome for that. And then your box colors. Tonight I'm gonna be using Soiree for the base coat on our box, which is this like grayish tan. And then Crinoline, which is like a creamy off-white for the polka dots. So it'll be a little different than the sample ones that we have. So the sample that we're using tonight has the black and the white polka dots. So, and then of course you should have your succulents in there. You probably have a variety between ones that are skinless, that don't have any bark, and ones that have the skin or this kind of like wood bark on the side. So when you dye these, this is gonna stay brown. So these usually look best in your darker colors. Like if you picked the eggplant, that dark plum, or the avocado, or basil green, those are all pretty dark greens. These look really good in those, whereas these ones look better in the lighter colors like the blues or the mint or sage greens, those different kind of colors. So that's what we're gonna do first. We're gonna dip our succulents first. You're probably gonna want a paper towel to lay them on while they dry, in case any water drips off. You can see on this one I had some water drip off. And then if you are done mixing your colors, go ahead and grab those. It's really important that you have that fork or whisk or something that you can use in between dipping. You're gonna notice that the dye is gonna settle down in the bottom of the container as we go. So probably after like every 2 or 3 flowers, just make sure that you're really whisking that up. Or if you're working on this with multiple people, in between people taking turns with it, really make sure that you're stirring it up, okay? So we're gonna start with the succulent colors first. I would say pick your least favorite flower to start with. If there's a color that you're thinking about, maybe start with your least favorite color, and then we'll kind of test some of the colors out. And then again, a paper towel or newspaper or even like an egg carton works really good for letting these dry on. All right, so this is the avocado green, which is like a muted, fun, dark green color. I feel like this is a little dark for an avocado. But, so what you're gonna do, you're just gonna take your flower, and I just kind of like dip it right in there. You don't even have to use your fingers. You can use the fork to kind of push that down. Really kind of flip it around, let it soak in there. And then as you pull that out, you want to make sure that you get as much of that color off as you can. So kind of hover it over the container, shake it just a little bit. Get as much of that dye color off as you can so that this dries really well and then it dries really quick, okay? So that's gonna kind of give you an idea of how the colors look. I would say kind of go from there, starting with your least favorite flower to maybe your least favorite color, and then the ones that you know you're gonna really want to pop in the container. Like this is gonna be one that we're gonna do one of the painted petal tutorials on. I really love this pistachio green, which is like a yellowy green tone. This works really good for these. So we're gonna pop this right in here. We're gonna roll them around. That color is looking great. Again, if you feel like the color is more like soup consistency, you need to add a little more water. We don't want it to look like paint or look chunky, so that's perfect. And then the other thing you can do is kind of open these petals up a little bit while it's wet. That way it looks more like a succulent. So a question that usually comes up during this is, what happens if you dip a flower and the color isn't as vibrant as you would like? Maybe the color is a little too light, maybe added a little too much water and there's kind of no going back. What you can do is let these dry to the touch. So about 10, 15-ish minutes, and then you can dip them again. You just want to make sure that you let them dry until they're at least damp. If they're too wet, they won't take on any more color. So again, if you dip a color and you feel like it's not quite there, let it dry for 10 minutes and then dunk it again. So this is the Stone Blue, which is like a grayish blue color. And I'm gonna use this really cute, pretty flower in there. This one, usually, this color looks good with like purple or some turquoise around the edges. That looks great. We're gonna get some of that excess water off there. So we're just gonna do this until all of our flowers have color on them. Perfect. You wanna make sure that you kind of lay them apart. If you need more than one paper towel, that's fine. We just don't want colors to be touching each other and kind of muddy each other up. So this is mint green. I like to do this on, this is, I think they call this a bali flower. I like the light green on these ones, and then I do a technique where we roll the outer edges in one of the darker greens. It usually turns out really pretty. We have a lot of people do that during the class. It kind of reminds me of cabbage leaves. How we doing, Kim? Any questions so far? All right. So far, so good. This is the easy part. Dipping all the flowers. So we're gonna switch gears and do a purple one. I think the purple looks best on the bark flowers. So we have this one. We're gonna dunk him right in there. And let some of that excess dry off. Perfect. All right, so if you have just 3 colors that you're working with, just kind of alternate between the 3 of those. We don't want all the succulents to be the same color. We want to kind of switch it up a little bit so you've got some variety. Let's do, we're gonna do this one. This is basil. This is a really nice realistic color too. So again, making sure you're getting as much of that dye off as possible. Pop that one right on there. That one's pretty dry, so we're gonna move him to the outside edge. Let's see, we'll do some more pistachio. I think this is my favorite one. It dries the most realistic. So after we get all of our succulents dipped in their colors, we're gonna let these dry for about 15 minutes. While these are drying, we're gonna work on painting our wood planter boxes. If you have a planter box in your kit. If you didn't opt for the planter box, you can take a little break. Wash your hands. I know it gets kind of messy. Let's see, have we done all of them? I think we've done all of them at least once. Let's do another stone blue. We'll do this little one. Really making sure that you're getting the dye all the way down in the petals. We want it to go all the way down inside. It doesn't matter if it's not 100% covering the back of the flower, since that's gonna get covered up, but we really want the top of the flower to be nice and saturated. So you can see on this one, there's like a lot of moisture down in there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let this dry upside down for right now to let some more of that color run out. That way he dries really well. We'll do another mint. And fun. We do this class, I think we've done this class at least once a week so far this month. And we have had some really fun and cool color combinations. Lots of different colors, and they've all looked great. That's the one thing about this project, is you can kind of do whatever, and once it's all assembled with the moss and everything, it looks great. All right. Just kind of moving some of these around so I can let them dry. And we'll do one more in the basil green. Last one. All right. All right, so that is it for dipping the succulents. So we're gonna let these dry. I might even move these off to the side for right now. I don't want these to get any paint on them while I am working on my box. So if you have like a ceiling fan or something that you can put those under, that's gonna be perfect. We are gonna let those dry for a bit. If you're still dipping, no worries. The box is probably the easiest step. So again, you're gonna want your big paintbrush, whatever big paintbrush came with your kit. As far as painting the inside of the box, it's really optional. You don't have to paint the inside if you don't want to. You can kind of leave that unfinished. And then you don't have to paint the bottom of the box if you don't want to either. It kind of depends on if somebody's gonna see that or not. It's your choice. I usually paint the inside of my box maybe about an inch or so. That way, if there's a little gap between my foam and the moss, you'll still be able to have some of that paint coverage in there. So this is Soiree, like a grayish tan color. And all we're gonna do is just a nice thin coat over all the surfaces that we want painted. Easy peasy. The paint that we're using is from a company called Country Chic. It's a chalk synthesis paint. It's considered an all-in-one paint, so it doesn't have to be waxed over or sealed. You can kind of leave it as is, and it'll dry nice and solid. Just want to make sure that you don't have a ton of drips going over the edge of the box as we go. So just a nice even coat on all the edges. All right. If you've got some brush strokes in there, that's okay. When we sand this after it's dry, that's going to kind of take all those out of there. How's everybody doing so far? We haven't got any questions yet, so I don't know if that's a good or a bad sign. If you're watching this, this was recorded live in our VIP group, and then we're gonna be uploading it onto our website afterwards in case you're wondering what we're talking about. All right, so we've got 3 sides, last side. Okay, so I did not paint the bottom on this one. I had a couple drips on there that I'm just gonna brush out. And I'm just gonna do a little bit inside. That way if I have a gap, it dries pretty good. The other thing you can do, if you have a dark color like black or navy, if you want that to be really dark, you can let this dry and you can do a second coat of paint over the top. We do that a lot with navy. You just want to make sure that it's dry to the touch in between. All right, so there's our box. So we're gonna let this dry for a couple minutes. Kind of set that off to the side. So the next things you're gonna want, thank you, while these succulents are still drying, you are going to want your acrylic paint. These need a little bit more time to dry. Your acrylic paint in the little paint pots or whatever acrylic paint you have at home that you want to use. You're also going to need your little detail brushes. And then don't get rid of the dye paint that you used earlier, because you can always use some of that to brush on some of your colors. We're actually going to use some of those to roll some of our smaller flowers in. And then if you haven't yet, your little water squirt bottle, this is what we're going to use to make all those colors fade in. Now is a really good time to run and fill this up with some water. Just regular tap water works great. You're probably going to go through about 2 fills of this if you're going to plan to paint on all of your succulents to make the edges look realistic. So run and fill that up real quick. These need a couple more minutes. If we put the color on too soon and add more water, it's not going to blend in. Everything's going to run off. Our base coat color is going to run off too. So you can see this one, this is the basil green. See how it's a little bit light in there, kind of around the edges? This would be a good one if you want that really rich, vibrant color that you would probably want to dip again. So I think I am going to dip this one. Looks different now that it's dried. So all I have to do is that same thing as before. I'm just going to dunk him back in, and he's a little damp, but there's no color coming off on my hand, so that's good. We're just going to dunk him again. Give him a little bit more of a green tone. That looks a lot better. So I've got 2 of these actually, and I'm going to do it on both of them. So this is the other one. We're going to pop him right back in there. Roll him around a little bit, make sure he's covered. So again, if you have flowers that you feel like they just aren't quite there with the color that you want, once they're just dry to the touch, they don't have color dripping off, you're good to dip them again. And then we're going to let those dry again. Next, we're going to be adding some of those realistic touches. Now is probably a good time if you want to wash your hands too. This is a pretty messy project, but it's worth it. It's worth it at the end. So I'm going to show you on our sample from before some of the things that we did, just kind of talk about the different techniques for those of you that need a little more time before we move on to this step. So we've got a few different things that we did on some of these sample ones. This one down here in the outer edge is one that we rolled in a second color. So it started with the mint green in the middle, and then we rolled the edge in some of that darker purple. That's why it kind of has that two-toned look. Same with this one over here. This one started with mint green in the middle, and then we rolled it in one of the darker greens around the edge. That to me is kind of one that looks a little bit like cabbage. And then you can see this one has some purple around the edges of that. That started with that stone blue, and then we brushed some purple in, and when we sprayed it, it kind of blended down in there to make it look more realistic. Same thing on this one, but we only did the outer petals on that. There's that mint green again. And this one, this could be either red or purple. They kind of dry very similar. And then we just have some others that we put like a little bit of turquoise on the edges. Some of them we just left plain. Like this doesn't have anything on it and it still looks great. You don't have to add any of the acrylic paint to them if you don't want to. You can leave them as is and they'll still look great. This one we brushed a little bit of like a pinky coral color in there. So it's all kind of about the colors that you are looking for. There were some that we said in our event before we posted and went live earlier that we were going to replicate. And those had a lot of red. There was one that had a lot of red on the edges, so I'm going to do that on this one. There was one that had just a little bit of green kind of on the center of the petals. We're going to do that on this one. So that green is going to be with one of the colors that we already had mixed. And then there was one that just had purple just around the very tips. I'm actually going to do that on this blue one. So we just want to check and make sure that these are feeling good, they're feeling dry to the touch. If your hands are real messy, I would suggest kind of washing those off a little bit, or if you have baby wipes or wet wipes, use one of those. I'm going to use a baby wipe to wipe my fingers off. And then it's probably a good idea too to get a new paper towel. This is a pretty wet step since we're going to be using a lot of that spray bottle to kind of blend those colors in. All right. So we're going to grab a new towel. We're gonna lay this out right here. You wanna make sure too that when you're getting started, you kind of start with a little bit of water on your paint brushes. So you can even spray these down first. That way when you're brushing that color on, it's not just gonna look like straight up paint. We don't want it to look like we have put lipstick on the edges of the flowers. We want it to look like we've maybe put a little bit of concealer or a little bit of blush on there, if that makes sense. We don't want a stark contrast. We just want to kind of blend it in a little bit. So this first tutorial is just going to be if you want to add a little color on the tips of the petals, just around kind of the edges. So I'm going to use the purple on this one. Again, make sure that it feels slightly dry to the touch. We don't want it soaking wet. You don't want drips of color coming off on your hand. I'm gonna wet my brush just a little bit more. And I'm gonna start with a little bit of the purple acrylic. And you can kind of brush, it's like a little upside down V shape right on there. I'm gonna try my best to get all the edges. They don't have to be perfect since we're going to be spraying it. Okay. So we'll kind of start there. And then you're going to grab your spray bottle and you're really going to get in there and spray those in. The more water you can add to those, the more that's going to kind of blend in there. And then you can, if you have a purple paint, you can kind of dip it in that purple, the dye color. And then again, just brushing it in on all those petals. So you can do this with red, you can do this with the pink. Yeah, Kim has mentioned. You want to make sure that you didn't water down your acrylic paint. Good point, Kim. Only like straight acrylic paint. The water that we're talking about is this water. There we go. Blend that in. There we go. So there's that one. So we're going to set him off to the side to dry. Now we're going to do that red. So I've got this. This is pistachio. We're going to fan him out a little bit. And this one I'm going to put a lot more paint on here. So I'm going to go in some smaller sections. This one. Yeah, we want this to look like he's mostly red in there. Perfect. So again, a little bit of red. Red's kind of a bold color, so if you're not sure that you want to paint the tips of your flowers, I would say maybe start with one of the other colors as a safe bet. Blend that in. So when you're using the straight acrylic paint, with the water bottle, I feel like the water bottle gives you a little more control than if you're dipping your brush in the watered down paint. I know there's some awesome tutorials out there that show how to use that. You can totally do that. I personally like when it's just the straight up acrylic because I can really see where I'm applying that. And then kind of brush that in. I'm already ready for spray bottle number 2. So you can see how that dries right in there. The more water you add, the more that kind of blends in. I'm thinking a little bit, boop, right there in the middle. Now these ones, when you're letting them dry, you want to keep them flat up like this. You don't want to put this upside down because then all that color is just going to run back off, and we want it till it gets blending down in the color into the flower. So we're going to set that one off to the side. All right. And then kind of that last technique that we have is either brushing right in the middle, kind of like what we just did with that green, with one of the colors that we already have. This is the basil that we're going to be using next. So this is the watered down dye color, and you're going to notice as soon as you brush that in there, that is really going to start blending that in. So I would just go a little slower, making sure that you're really getting that in the areas that you want it to be. You have a little more control with the acrylic and the spray bottle. Whereas this one, once I got that wet brush in there, it's kind of doing its thing. So you want to try and make this as even as possible. You want to try and get all those petals. I know sometimes with these wood flowers, you can have petals that are a little bit damaged. So that really helps, like how I'm spinning this around, and I can see what it's going to look like on all directions. I'm going to try and get some in the center here. So again, I'm using basil, the basil green. And then you can spray this again if you want to let that blend in a little bit more. There we go. So that one's with the brush. So I'm gonna kind of use that same color in a different way. What I'm gonna do for this flower, this nice full one, is I'm gonna roll this, just the outer edges, in a second color. That's gonna kind of give it that two-toned look. So it's two separate colors on there. So what you're gonna wanna do for that is pinch the center and then the back, like the base part of the flower, kind of pinch it right there. And then you're gonna hover it above the container so that just those outer edges are in there, and you're almost gonna spin it like a wheel. You're just kind of spinning in there so that just those outer edges get that. See that? I think that's my favorite tutorial. I like that one the best out of all the techniques. It just gives it a little something. So this one, I'm not gonna spray. I'm just gonna leave it as is. I want that color to really soak in there. You can do that with all of the colors if you like. If you wanna do that with the purple, I've got this dark green that I can kind of roll in this eggplant. So this started out as basil. And I'm just gonna roll the edges in the eggplant. There we go. So it's not as noticeable as the mint green with the other color, just a little bit, just kind of right in there. Almost looks like the bark around the edges. Any questions so far? Good? All right. So you can get as colorful and crazy as you like. You can do no colors if you like. Personal preference. We had somebody do pink on a flower like this during the class the other day, and it turned out really pretty. So I'm gonna try that on this one. We have seen some really cool color combinations. A little bit of water. bit more around the edges. So this one I'm not gonna do as much. That way it looks like the tops of these are just like kissed by the color. A little bit. So this is how this one's drying now with that red in there. This one might be my favorite one. Kim is nodding in agreement. This one looks great. This one, let's see. Maybe we'll do a little green around the edges. And then the rest of them are just gonna stay as is. They're just gonna stay how they are. This is going to be very subtle with this little bit of pistachio. If you have the time, I highly recommend going to Pinterest and just type in succulents, and you can see kind of all the different ones that are out there. There are rainbow succulents, believe it or not, which sound like something I'd like to try another time, but definitely want to try. There are so many different colors. I wish that I could keep real succulents alive, but that's just not the point that I'm at in life right now. I am great with these fake succulents. So that didn't do much on that one, just a little variation around the edges. Little bit. So do as much of that as you like. Another great opportunity to wash your hands once you got all those on there. So that's gonna be the last bit of painting that we have to do on the succulents. That's the end for the succulents until they're ready to go on the box. So we're gonna make sure that everything dries. Maybe I'll do a little bit, I didn't use the turquoise. I'll do a little bit of turquoise on one. We'll do some, this one kind of looks like a rose. We'll do a little bit around the edges. I like to use the turquoise on the blue ones just to add a little variation. Little bit. Not too much, because this color is really pretty by itself. Doesn't need a lot. I'm gonna brush some of that in. Here we go. All right. We're gonna let those dry. Get all this paint stuff out of the way. Very carefully kind of shimmy these over. So our next step, even if you're choosing not to put the stencil on your box, you're still gonna wanna lightly sand your box. That's gonna help take care of all those rough edges. Ooh, so here's how my soiree dried on there. Doesn't that look pretty? My box was kind of rough on this side. So I really want to make sure that I smooth all of that out before I add anything else to it, before I do any of the stenciling on there. So again, even if you don't want to stencil on your box, you still want to kind of smooth all of that out so that it's nice and flat. So it's going to be the fine grit sandpaper, which is the 220. You want to make sure that your box feels totally dry to the touch on all the edges before you sand it. You don't want it to be wet because it'll just smear the paint around. And then after you sand it, you can choose to go on and stencil it, or if you were thinking that you wanted to add a second coat of color, you can do that too. So it's just nice and light. Get rid of those gritty areas. See how nice and smooth that is now compared to how it was before. It was really rough before. All right. How's everybody doing? Stencil is definitely the most difficult part of the box. If you haven't used one of these Mylar stencils that we're about to use, let's say maybe practice on the bottom of the box first. Again, they're a little different than the vinyl stencils that we normally use. So usually when you come and do one of our sign classes, we have a big sticky stencil for you to use. The nice thing about those is that they stick down really well, but they're also one-time use. So for us to do every side of the box, we'd have to have 4 different stencils, which would be a lot. Whereas with the Mylar stencil, the shapes aren't gonna come out 100% as crisp as the vinyl stencil will, but it's gonna be great for this kind of rustic planter box look. So I'm gonna kind of show you on mine. You can see my polka dots from a distance are amazing. Up close, I maybe have a couple little rough edges on there, which is okay. I wanted this to look vintage, to look aged. So they're not 100% perfect, but I like that. So if you sanded your box, go ahead and grab a paper towel or rag and wipe all that dust off of there. And then the polka dots are the easiest stencil. We've found they're the easiest ones to use so far. I would say the chevron is probably the hardest stencil to use. So the key to these is you can, if you want, you can cut it down to be just the size that you want. We kind of cut this nice big full sheet in case you want to use this for other things. Some of you in your kits, you might have gotten one that's already cut down because we found that that's a little easier to use than the big sheet. The key to these, especially with the polka dot, is to focus on one dot at a time. So we're really gonna press that one down and we're gonna stencil just that one dot on there. And we're gonna try and get it in just one coat of paint, not multiple coats of paint. So we can really switch this around and use it for each area. Or if you have the smaller one, you can just wipe it off with a wet paper towel in between or just kind of dry off any wet spots. So again, you might have a foam brush with yours. If you've got an old like kids paintbrush, these work really well too. You might have a foam wedge. Kind of all do the same thing. It's all in the technique. So the color that I'm going to be using for my stencil is Crinoline, which is a creamy kind of off-white color. And I'm not going to do a ton of polka dots. Like on my other box, I have them where they're kind of going off the edge and kind of meeting each other on the side. I'm just going to do a few on this box, not a ton. So probably just these that kind of sit right here on the face of the box, not any of the ones that are going off the edges. I just want just a couple. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start with just this one. I'm gonna get just a little bit of paint on my brush. You're probably used to us telling you too, if you come to one of our sign classes, not to press with the brush, not to stipple because it'll force the paint down there. That is actually the best technique for these, is just a little bit. We're just kind of pressing the paint on there. We want it kind of thick since we're just gonna do the one coat. And then I'm gonna pull this off so you can see, but if you're gonna keep going, go ahead and leave your stencil on there. So that's how that looks with just that one coat. It looks great. I'm gonna put this right back where it was so I know where the other ones need to go. And again, it's just gonna be very light. I've still got a lot of paint left on my brush, so I can kind of keep going. Right over here on this one. Little bit more paint on that foam brush. If you feel like you put too much paint on there, you can dot some of it off on the actual piece of stencil. It's very light, so if you see my hand, I'm not pushing hard. It's very quick, very light over the top of that. So I'm gonna come press over here around this one. Super light. I'm not trying to push it down underneath the edges. pull some of this excess paint off from up here. So we had a lot of people in class, they would do one side and they really liked the way that the stencil looked on one side and they left it just like that. A lot of people that had the stripes or the grain sack pattern did that and it looked really cute. So you don't have to do the stencil on all of the sides if you don't want to. There's that one. Last one over here. So this one I'm not pressing down as hard and you'll probably see the difference with the stencil. It's lifted up a smidge. There we go. So that's one side. So as you're turning this around to do the other sides, you have to really keep an eye on how that paint's drying. We don't want it to be resting on any of this if it feels wet to the touch still. So you might want to fan that a little bit. If you've got 3 sides done and you're waiting, just make sure you're not turning it while that's still wet. How are we doing so far? Good? All right. So we're going to turn this. So if you do have one of these brushes, here, I'll put this up here so you can see better. Same thing, like a good stiff brush usually works best. So I'm going to do right here like this on this side. Okay. This is one of our old brushes that we've used in kids' classes before, so it's nice and stiff. Just kind of filling those in. If you find too that you really want them to be nice and filled in, you can always go back and use one of those detail brushes from the kit to kind of fill these in a little bit afterwards. So I need a little bit more paint on my brush here. There we go. All right, so 2 sides down. So now I need to wait for one of these to be dry to the touch before I can move on to one of my other sides, because I don't want to smear any of these. This one's got a little bit of wetness still kind of right there. I want to make sure that I don't smear that. So we're gonna let that sit for just a minute. Check on your succulents and see how they're feeling. They should be starting to feel dry unless there were some that you really sprayed. Like this one. This one's still pretty wet. We put a lot of water into that one. They're probably not gonna be 100% dry by the time we put them into our containers, just because it usually takes about 24 hours for them to fully dry out. But we can get them pretty dry. They'll be pretty dry by the time we kind of put those into our planter box. All right. Ooh, we're so close. That one's real close. So again, if you left your planter box just a regular solid color, you can either choose to do a second coat on it. I'm gonna show you once I get all of these polka dots on there how to really rough these up and make them look really vintage. Like the samples that we had on our site, we had the box that had the turquoise, and we have the black one that I showed earlier. All right, so we're gonna move on to this next side, same thing. So again, you're welcome to keep your pattern kind of going off the edge of the box. For time's sake, I'm not gonna do that, just so I don't have as many dots to paint. Again, if you picked a stencil and you don't want to, you don't have to, just kind of adds a little something. There we go. Very lightly kind of spreading that over the surface of that dot. If you feel like maybe the color's not 100% even all the way across there. You can go back and kind of go over that again. But when we sand these to smooth them out, that should kind of help take care of that. So it doesn't have to be 100% perfect. Sanding is kind of like insurance for making sure that it turns out great. Everything looks better with a little bit of distressing. Just real light. Okay. That's our third side. We only got one more to go. That side's real close. See, I went a little too soon and I lost a little bit on that dot, but that's okay. I can go back and fill him in. Fill him in a little bit later. So now we're waiting on this side to feel dry enough to rest on this. I think we're probably good. We're gonna do this very last side. One more set of dots on here. So these reusable stencils are great for door hangers, if you're painting door hangers, if you have old picture frames that are kind of flat, paint them a color and then you can do a stencil over the top. I have seen where people use like a foam roller over these. You can use painter's tape to hold them down. I would be intrigued to see how that turns out. Last couple, so I had a lot of paint. That one's probably gonna be a little fuzzy. I had a little bit too much paint on my brush there. That's okay, that happens. That last one, boom, done. So all you have to do is kind of wipe that paint off. If you have a good shallow sink, you can kind of run it in there and scrub it with a sponge to get that paint off. And then just let it dry flat and you'll be able to use it over and over again. All right. So we're gonna let this dry for a couple minutes. We want the box to be completely finished before we start adding our succulents to it. So I'm gonna let this side dry, but I'm gonna show you on one of my other sides if you are ready, if you didn't stencil your box and you're ready for the sanding, how to rough up your box a little bit more and how to finish it. And then I'll do that again once this side's a little bit more dry. I'm gonna add a little bit of paint to this one little dot. He got a little bumper scuff on him. There we go. So that'll smooth out when we sand it. Okay, so the sandpaper that we used earlier, that fine grit, this is just gonna smooth everything out. If your dots or your stripes or your chevrons just need a little bit of smoothing, or you wanna take off just very minimal paint, you can do this over your dots, over your edges of your box. If you want a really, really rough look, you're gonna use that coarse grit sandpaper. This is to remove a lot of the paint. So this is gonna take off a ton of paint. So you can see that's going through those dots and really taking it down to the soiree, the color underneath. So if you like vintage stuff, this is gonna be the sandpaper for you. That one's still a little bit wet, so we're gonna leave him. So I'm actually gonna do that on all the edges of my box. I like things to be a little bit on the rougher side. I think this just kind of helps mask things that aren't perfect. So again, this is the coarse grit. If you're not sure if you wanna try this, start with the fine grit and then you can switch to this one, because once you sand it with this coarse grit, that's it. It's gonna stay roughed up like that. It's kind of like a one and done. So. There we go. that's what it looks like with coarse grit all over the edges. You can do some around the top if you want it really rough. And then same as before, you want to use a paper towel or a rag and wipe all the dust off. So before you sand, you need to just make sure that your paint's 100% dry. Just getting all that dust off there. Clean up my area a little bit. Okay. And then once everything's dry, we're gonna wax our box. The wax that we're using is pixie dust hemp paste wax. It's kind of this funky lime green color, but it dries clear. And if you sanded your box a lot, you're gonna notice that it's really gonna brighten your colors back up, especially if you used a dark color and you sanded it a lot, like navy or black. We really wanna make sure that it goes on nice and smooth. We don't want it to be sticky or greasy. So we're gonna take a chunk, and then with a clean rag, we're gonna start buffing that in. So that chunk that I took is probably gonna be enough to do my entire box. Just kind of working that in until it's a matte finish. We don't want it greasy or sticky or shiny. So that is perfect, just like that. So you're almost buffing it in and then kind of buffing it back off. Just enough to soak in there. How we doing so far? So far, so good. Again, we're using a clean rag, buffing that wax in there. If you're still working on painting, no worries. You can always wax your box once everything's together too. If it's easier to do it that way, that is no problem at all. It's just gonna kind of help brighten everything back up. Now you don't have to wax the inside of the box, and you don't really have to wax the outside or the bottom of the box if you don't want to. Some people prefer to put like felt sticky pads on the bottom of the box. If you're gonna put it on a nice tabletop, that'll just protect your surface. The wax does make this durable. It makes it heat and water resistant, but it's not gonna make it waterproof, and the succulents aren't waterproof. So I don't recommend putting these outside. I would even be really cautious about like covered porches. If it's a temperature controlled covered porch, you're fine. But if the windows are open, the most problematic thing that could happen is the succulents could absorb moisture and they could get kind of moldy. That does happen sometimes just because they are wood and they're real thin. But inside, the wax is gonna be just fine. So again, just kind of run your hands over it, make sure it feels nice and smooth. Should be nice and smooth like butter after all that wax and that nice smooth paint. All right. Okay, so our box is gonna be ready for some succulents. Check in on those again and see how they're drying. If you have some that are really, really wet still, if you have a ceiling fan or something that you can put those by, that would be great. I don't recommend blow drying these. We've had people ask about that before. The heat will kind of make these wilt, almost like a real flower, just because they're so thin. And it'll kind of push these petals out and damage them. So as much as they can just kind of sit and be, they'll be totally fine. So if your succulents are still a little bit too wet to work with, the next step that you can do is get your foam ready for your box. So this is one that Kim has shaved down for us to fit in there. You could even have a little bit less if you're sharing foam with someone. You just need enough right in the center for all your wires to kind of poke into, because we're gonna angle our succulents in as we arrange them. So just as long as you have maybe about 3.5-ish inches, it'll be perfect. If you want your piece to be a little more stable, You can add a bit of hot glue underneath your piece of foam and position that in the box. And that'll just make it easier when you're arranging these. And also if you're gonna be transporting this, like if you're not making this at home, it won't fall out on your way home. It'll just be nice and stable in there. So just a little bit of hot glue. And kind of press that in. There we go. All right. So if you haven't yet, now's a great time to plug in that hot glue gun. We're gonna be using that next for putting all of the wire pieces into our succulents. That's what's gonna help arrange them and make sure that they don't fall out. You should have a piece of wire for every succulent that came with your kit. If you don't, no worries. By the time we get to the last few, we'll have a good solid base that we can stick in there. Or if you have toothpicks, or even like a skewer, like a shish kebab skewer, anything like that's gonna work great. The wire, the reason we picked that is because it's already green. So it kind of blends in a little bit easier. So when your foam's in your box, all you're gonna do is take your wire, grab your dry succulents whenever they're dry. The wire goes into the base of the flower, maybe about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. We don't wanna poke it out too far because it'll damage inside the flower. If you see in here, they're kind of sewn together with some thread. We don't wanna bust that because then the whole thing will just fall apart. We just want it a little bit in there. And then we're gonna put some glue around the base to help hold that wire in place, just where the wire meets, right at the base of the flower. We wanna make sure that we're using the succulents that are dry because now I'm gonna let this sit face down like that. If it was still wet, some of the color would be running off. We don't want that. So just our succulents that are dry to the touch. So again, about 1/4 to 1/2 inch, little bit. Dab of hot glue in there. We're gonna do that on every succulent. A little bit. Dab of glue. Okay, making sure that doesn't go too far in so it doesn't damage the flower. Also want to try and get rid of as many of those long stringies as you can, those kind of spidery strings. Gluing them right in the base. Again, you want to make sure it's a dry succulent, especially like if you pick one up and you realize that it's wet and you have color on your hand, kind of wipe your hand off in between. We want to make sure they're dry before we put them in the box, that way they don't transfer their colors onto each other. That happens sometimes with our regular wood flowers. If you arrange them too soon, they can kind of drip onto each other. Sometimes it's not easy to fix, especially if you have light colors. This one's feeling pretty dry. This one's pretty delicate here on the base. I can see that some of the thread is a little bit loose, so I'm gonna be really careful with this one. That wire is kind of like barely in there. It's more or less just kind of resting. With enough glue, that one should be okay. How's everybody doing so far? Hopefully you haven't burned any fingertips off. And then we just got one more to go. See on the shelf by the vinyl cutter if there's a piece of the moss that's like a square. There might be some bags on the shelf. Okay, so then I have a couple of these left over. So we just need all that glue to set so that we don't have to worry about these falling off when they're arranging them in there. Again, if you want to, you can glue your piece of foam down inside, your choice. That's just gonna help make it a little more secure. We're gonna kind of set those off to the side. So what we're gonna do is we are going to arrange the succulents from biggest to smallest. We want the biggest flowers to take up the bulk of the center of the box. So on this one, you'll see these ones are sitting up a little bit higher than the others. Those are kind of like the main focal point. And then as they go down, they kind of poke in a little bit more. You also have moss that you can put into your box. Moss is just for filling in gaps where you don't have a flower. So like right here, we had a hole between our flowers and the edge of the box. You don't have to add any moss to your box if you don't want to, but it does kind of help add a little bit of a realistic touch. Now, those of you that have the kits, you guys are kind of lucky because we were able to get these like pads of moss that can kind of sit right around the top edge of your box. You might have to trim this down a little bit. I think this is great because then you're guaranteed to have moss in between all of your flowers as you're arranging them in there. So you might just have to kind of trim this down just a smidge, and then you can use some of the excess to kind of pull and stick in. You should have a little bit of loose moss in there too. But again, moss is optional. You don't have to put it in if you don't want to. Some scissors, Kim. We're gonna trim this little piece down a little bit. You can even set this right in, kind of see how it'll fit. Thank you. This can go right over your piece of foam. It's kind of like the easy route. Kim agrees. I like that. It's less messy than when we have our classes with our big tufts of moss everywhere. We probably empty our vacuum canister at least once after that class. That looks great. So again, you can glue this right on top of that foam block. Ready for another glue stick. There we go. It's got that nice netting on the bottom, so it'll kind of hold itself in place and keep its shape without damaging the moss on the top. Looks good. All right. So again, gluing a wire into the bottom of every succulent. You just want to make sure those are nice and stable. That way we can arrange those without that wire falling out. We want to make sure that our box is ready to go. We've got our foam inside. We've got everything sanded, waxed if you're choosing to wax, or if you're going to wait and do that afterwards, you can do that. So when you're ready, you're just going to start kind of grabbing those large flowers. And you can do one kind of straight up in the center, or if you've got several large ones, I kind of like to stay in the center, but angle those in together. And they don't have to go all the way down in so that it's touching the foam. You can leave those up a little bit, so that's maybe about an inch, inch and a half above the foam right in there. And that's gonna add a little more height into our container. The key to arranging them is balance. We want the container to feel balanced all the way around. Angling really helps with that. You also want to keep an eye on your colors, like the base colors. So if I put all my blue flowers over here, that is not going to feel very balanced, and your eye is going to kind of go right to that area where you have all that same color. I'm going to shift this one over just a little. So alternating colors, going from biggest to largest. Sorry, biggest to smallest. Good save, Kim. There we go. So you might find too, as you put them in, you might have to shimmy them around a little bit to make more space. Okay. And then once you put a succulent in, it doesn't have to stay there. You can always move it to a different spot if you feel like it needs a different location in the box. So I probably want to put something blue over here. Break up some of these other colors. Again, we're angling. Let's see. Maybe put this purple one in over here. So again, if you need more room, you can kind of very carefully lift these up a little bit. Move them in a little bit closer to each other. I might move this one in a little bit. We don't want it to feel super crowded, but we also don't want big, huge gaps in between. And if you feel like your wires are maybe a little too long, feel free to snip some of those off if you've got some really good scissors, or if you've got some needle nose pliers, wire cutters. All right, so we're gonna do green right in here, dark green. This is a very full succulent planter. We're gonna do blue right here. And this guy kind of right down here in the edge. And then you're just gonna kind of rotate that around. So you can see right here, this is gonna be a good spot for me to either move a flower over here or to add some moss in there. There's kind of a big gap between that flower and the edge of the container. Everything over here looks pretty good. Little gaps like this, you can put little tufts of moss in there too. That kind of helps fill that in. Just making sure everything looks balanced. There's another gap that's gonna be good for moss. We want every succulent to kind of get its own attention. So I'm gonna pull this one up a little bit because that one, we did a lot of work on that. We wanna make sure that one's visible. Same thing on this one. He's gonna come up just a little bit. There we go. So giving some of them a little more height is gonna help it feel a little less crowded. This one, he's really pretty. Needs to come out. How's everybody doing so far? Okay, so see this one, he came out of his glue. So this one's gonna need just a dab more hot glue. All right. And then if you have some moss that you're planning to put in, this is the messy step. So you don't have to glue the moss in if you don't want to, but you just need just a little bit, kind of tuft in some small areas. So that's really gonna help kind of hide that hole in there. Same thing, just a little bit right here to kind of poke out. I like a little bit just in around the edges under these edge flowers. This is where I have that pretty big hole over here. A lot of times you kind of have to fan the moss out a little bit. It might be kind of all bunched up together in a ball. Right here. We're just using that to fill in the holes in between the succulents. Pretty big gap right there in between those flowers. So I might try, this is a different kind that I got at the craft store the other day. Go. And then you can, if you want to put a little bit in the top, if you have pieces that fell off as you were working, This just kind of helps add to the realism. Make sure that we kind of fan that back out so that it's sitting on top of the moss. We want that to look like it's sitting on top. Little hole right there. Put another little chunk in there. 2. Very messy. It's a good thing to do over the trash can. Okay, so if you didn't wax your box before, you're gonna wanna make sure that you do that now. Just make sure that you get any of that dust off of there or the dirt from adding the moss. You just don't wanna get dirt mixed in with your wax. That is no good. Fan those succulents open just a little bit more. Making sure they're really able to take up a lot of the space in there. Any questions about the moss? Everybody looks like they're